Denge, Romney Marsh, Kent, England, 14th September 1928. The concrete structure rose from the marshland like the inner surface of a vast ear, 20 feet high and 200 feet wide, in a perfect parabolic curve, its face turned eastward across the channel toward France and the continent beyond. And at its focal point stood a microphone assembly mounted on a swivel mechanism that could be rotated by hand wheel to track the azimuth of approaching sound. While Lieutenant Commander Harold Wimpole of the Royal Navy stood in the observation post with his logbook open and his pocket watch checked against Greenwich Mean Time, recording the detection of a Vickers, Virginia twin-engine bomber at a range of 15 miles, the drone of its twin Napier Lion engines arriving at the collector dish a full 12 minutes before the aircraft itself appeared as a dark speck against the afternoon overcast at 3,000 feet altitude. The Air Ministry had commissioned a network of these acoustic mirrors along the Kent and Sussex coasts, beginning in 1916 during the Great War, when German Gotha bombers had struck London without warning, killing hundreds, and the primitive listening stations had proven capable of providing 20 minutes advance notice of incoming raids, enough time to scramble fighters and sound air raid warnings across the southern counties. And now, in 1928, the system had been refined and expanded, with larger parabolic reflectors constructed of reinforced concrete, poured into wooden forms and finished smooth to focus sound waves with mathematical precision onto the microphone array. Wimpole noted the temperature at 52 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds from the southeast at 8 knots, conditions that carried sound well across the water, and he instructed Operator Second Class Davies to rotate the collector through a slow sweep of the eastern quadrant, listening through heavy Bakelite headphones for the characteristic beat frequency of aircraft engines, the rhythmic pulse that distinguished powered flight from the random noise of wind and waves and distant shipping. The sound mirror station at Denge was the largest in the chain, its massive curve of gray concrete dominating the flat landscape of sheep pastures and drainage ditches, visible for miles across the marsh where curlews and redshanks picked through the mud, and the smell of salt and rotting vegetation hung in the air. And nearby stood two smaller mirrors, one spherical dish 30 feet in diameter and another 20-foot reflector, all oriented toward different sectors of approach to provide overlapping coverage and triangulation of incoming targets. Davies reported contact bearing 095 degrees, engine note consistent with twin-prop configuration, probable bomber type, and Wimpole confirmed the reading against the scheduled test flight from RAF Manston, checking the mathematics of sound propagation, 1,100 feet per second at current temperature and humidity, calculating range by the delay between initial detection and visual acquisition, entering figures in columns that would be analyzed by scientists from the National Physical Laboratory, who were attempting to quantify the maximum effective range under varying atmospheric conditions. The concrete had taken months to cure properly, the contractors working through the winter of 1927 to complete the pour before frost could damage the surface, and the result was a structure that would stand for a century, though its operational lifespan would prove far shorter than its builders imagined. Wimpole had served on destroyers during the war, had survived Jutland aboard HMS Tipperary's sister ship, and he understood the value of early warning, the difference between scrambling fighters with altitude advantage and being caught on the ground with engines cold, and he took his duty at the sound mirror with the same seriousness he had brought to keeping watch in the North Sea, scanning the horizon for the telltale smoke of German dreadnoughts, though now he scanned with ears instead of eyes, listening for the whisper of danger carried on the wind. Davies removed his headphones and reported the contact had passed overhead, bearing now 270 degrees and fading, and Wimpole made the final notation in his log: test successful, detection range 14.8 miles, tracking maintained throughout approach, before lighting a cigarette and looking out across the marsh toward the gray line of the channel, where the next war, if it came, would first announce itself as a distant hum in the concrete ear, a sound of engines, and the future arriving faster than anyone wanted to believe. Hythe, Kent, England, 15 August 1935. Squadron leader Geoffrey Pierce stood before the curved wall of the sound mirror in the early morning darkness, frost still visible on the concrete despite the approaching dawn, and listened to Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding explain why the entire acoustic early warning system would soon be obsolete, replaced by a new technology the scientists at Bawdsey Manor were calling radio direction finding, though the term radar would eventually supplant it. A system that could detect aircraft at 70 miles instead of 15, and could operate in fog, rain, and storm conditions that rendered sound mirrors useless. The demonstration had been arranged to show visiting members of Parliament the capabilities and limitations of the existing network before appropriations were debated for the new radio towers, and Pierce had been detailed from 25 Squadron to participate, flying a Hawker Fury biplane on a prescribed course from Dover to Dungeness at varying altitudes, while the sound mirror operators attempted to track his approach, a test that would be repeated with the experimental RDF equipment for comparison. The morning was clear and cold, temperature 38 degrees with no wind, ideal conditions for acoustic detection, and the mirror's operators reported ready at 0540 hours, their microphones calibrated and headphones tested, the hand wheels greased and the azimuth scale checked against magnetic bearings. Pierce climbed into the Fury's cockpit while ground crew swung the wooden propeller through compression, the Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine coughing blue smoke before catching with a roar that echoed across the airfield, and he ran through his checks, oil pressure rising, coolant temperature and limits, magnetos firing on both circuits, before taxiing to the grass strip and advancing the throttle for takeoff, the biplane lifting off at 65 knots and climbing through 500 feet where the coastal haze still clung to the ground in gray streamers. He leveled at 3,000 feet and turned on to the briefed heading, following the coastline westward at 140 knots indicated airspeed, the Kestrel's exhaust stacks glowing cherry red in the instrument panel's reflection, and below him the sound mirror stations marked on his map as classified installations, though their purpose was an open secret among the flying community. Massive concrete structures that served as navigation markers as much as defensive sensors. The radio crackled, with Dover Control confirming his departure time for the benefit of the mirror operators who would be listening now, heads cocked toward their equipment, fingers poised to note the first detection, and Pierce held his altitude steady, resisting the pilot's instinct to weave or vary speed, flying straight and level as though on a bombing run, giving them the best possible target. The sun broke the horizon behind him, casting long shadows across the Romney Marsh, where sheep grazed between drainage ditches and the ancient churches of the Cinque Ports stood as they had for 8 centuries. And Pierce thought about the layers of defense that had protected this coast, the beacons that had warned of the Spanish Armada, the Martello towers built against Napoleon, the sound mirrors raised against the Kaiser's bombers, and now the radio towers that would watch for Hitler's Luftwaffe if the politicians in London and Berlin couldn't maintain the peace. The radio crackled again, and Dover Control relayed a message from the sound mirror station. Contact established at range 12 miles, tracking maintained, predicted course accurate within 2 degrees. And Pierce acknowledged, noting his position as passing Dymchurch, the beach defenses visible below, where pillboxes and wire obstacles had been constructed during the last war and never fully removed, rusting reminders that invasion was not merely historical possibility, but recurring threat. He descended to 1,000 feet as briefed for the second phase of the demonstration, watching his altimeter unwind as the Fury dropped into the layer of haze, where visibility decreased to 2 miles and moisture collected on the windscreen. And immediately the radio reported loss of contact, the sound mirror operators unable to maintain tracking once their target descended into the thermal layer, where temperature inversion bent sound waves upward away from the collectors, a fundamental limitation of acoustic detection that no amount of engineering could overcome. Pierce continued westward through the haze, invisible now to the listeners on the ground, and understood viscerally why Dowding was pushing for the radio towers, why the Air Ministry was prepared to spend millions on an unproven technology. Because the next war would be fought by faster aircraft at higher altitudes, arriving in larger numbers, and 20 minutes warning would not be enough, would not prevent the bombs from falling on London and Southampton and Birmingham, would not save the civilians who had been promised that the bomber would always get through. He climbed back to 3,000 feet as he approached Ingenious, the haze thinning, and the radio confirmed contact re-established at range 8 miles, the operators reporting engine note consistent with single-seat fighter type. And Pierce smiled grimly at the irony that they could hear him but still couldn't stop him. That detection without interception was merely data without consequence, numbers in a logbook recording the approach of disaster. Swingate, Dover, Kent, England, 12 August 1940. The sound mirror stood silent and abandoned, its concrete face streaked with gold droppings and salt spray, the microphone assembly removed and the observation post empty except for scattered papers and a broken chair. While 3 miles inland, the new chain home radar station transmitted its pulses into the sky. The 350-foot steel towers visible for 20 miles in every direction. And in the operations room deep beneath Dover Castle, WAAF plotters pushed markers across the map table, tracking Luftwaffe formations assembling over Calais for the afternoon's raid. The information arriving by telephone from the radar stations at Dunkirk, Rye, and Pevensey, providing fighter command with height, bearing, and strength of the incoming attack, a full hour before the bombers would cross the coast. Flight Lieutenant Margaret Forsyth stood at the plotting table with her headset clamped over her carefully pinned hair, listening to the running commentary from the chain home operator at Dunkirk, who reported approximately 40 contacts at Angels 15,000 feet altitude, bearing 285 degrees, range 60 miles and closing. Classification assessed as Dornier Do-17 bombers with Messerschmitt Bf-109 escort based on formation spacing and radar return characteristics. She relayed the information to the duty controller, who immediately scrambled 32 Squadron from Biggin Hill and 615 Squadron from Kenley, 12 Hawker Hurricanes climbing hard to intercept before the Germans could reach their targets along the Thames estuary. The pilots nursing their Merlin engines up through cold air to 20,000 feet, where they would have altitude advantage and the sun at their backs. Outside the operations room, the sound of anti-aircraft guns echoed across the harbor as a lone Dornier swept in low over the water, having detached from the main formation to photograph the port facilities, and the 3.7-inch guns of the 53rd Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment engaged at maximum depression, their shells raising waterspouts in the harbor while the bomber jinked and weaved, its black crosses clearly visible against the camouflage paint before it disappeared behind the cliff face, trailing smoke from one engine. Forsyth marked the new contact on the board. Single hostile, low level, course 110 degrees, and the controller diverted a section of Spitfires from 610 Squadron to pursue, though the Dornier would likely reach French airspace before interception, the mathematics of speed and distance working in its favor. The main formation continued its approach, the plotters updating positions every 30 seconds as fresh radar reports arrived, the track showing the classic pattern of a deliberate raid: steady course, constant altitude, no evasive maneuvers. And Forsyth recognized the target would be either the Shorts aircraft factory at Rochester or the oil storage tanks at Thameshaven, both vital to Britain's war effort, both heavily defended by anti-aircraft batteries and barrage balloons. She had been working in the plotting room for 6 weeks since completing her training at Leighton Buzzard, had learned to interpret the clinical language of radar reports and translate them into the positions of real aircraft flown by real men intent on killing her countrymen. And she performed her duty with the same steady competence she had brought to her previous work as a mathematics teacher in Surrey, finding grim satisfaction in the precision required, the absolute necessity of accuracy when lives depended on correct plotting. The chain-home system had proven its worth in the weeks since the Luftwaffe had begun its sustained assault on British airfields and radar stations, providing the early warning that allowed Fighter Command to husband its limited resources, scrambling squadrons only when targets were confirmed, rather than maintaining standing patrols that exhausted pilots and burned irreplaceable fuel. And the contrast with the old sound mirror system was total. Where acoustic detection had offered 20 minutes warning under ideal conditions, radar provided an hour's notice in any weather, day or night, giving the defenders time to climb to altitude and position for attack. The update arrived from Dunkirk Station. Hostile formation, now 45 miles, maintaining course and speed, fighter escort beginning to weave, probable fuel consideration. And Forsyth marked the change, knowing that the Messerschmitts would soon have to turn back or risk running dry over England, leaving the bombers vulnerable to the hurricane sections climbing to meet them. Through the telephone line, she could hear the radar operator's breathing, the hum of the transmitter, the faint scratching of his pen on paper as he logged the sweep returns, and behind those sounds, the deeper vibration of diesel generators providing power to the station. The entire apparatus of technological warfare reduced to electrical pulses and human interpretation, machines and minds working together to defend the realm. The controller ordered 32 Squadron to vector 090 degrees, climb to Angels 20, and Forsyth listened to the acknowledgement crackle back, the pilot's voice calm despite the adrenaline that must be surging through him, the training and discipline holding firm. And she thought briefly of the abandoned sound mirror standing useless on the cliff top at Denge, its concrete face turned eastward still, listening to silence, while overhead the battle was joined. Hurricanes diving on Dorniers, Messerschmitts counterattacking, the sky above Kent becoming a tangle of contrails and tracer fire, and the radar watching it all, seeing what human eyes could not, providing the information that would determine whether Britain survived or fell.